Give me 1 second here. Well, I'll just do it this way. Okay, we're going to do something different tonight than we've done up to now. And for those who study Rav Ginsburg's books and watch him online, and especially people who used to tune in or come to the English class that Rav Ginsburg gave over a couple of years in Yerushalayim once a month, where what he does, and this is really his chiddush, very innovative idea that he uses all the time, where he takes a person, a word, or a concept, and he arranges it according to the sfirot. So again, for those who were either there in person or watched the English classes, he did this just almost all the time, is he would take, whether it's Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Moshe, Mashiach, David, Miriam, just a whole range of people, and he'd explain what's the aspect of Keter in this person, what's the aspect of Chachma, of Bina, of Dat, and he would go through all the Sfirot. And when you learn like this, it is so holistic, it is so integrative, because you see the full picture of a personality. But he also does it with words and concepts. So we are just finishing here in Israel the 37th day of the Omer. And after Lag BaOmer, the energy changes. Not only does the morning practices stop, but our focus begins to change and move towards Shavuot and the idea of receiving the Torah again, because every year we receive the Torah again, at least potentially. Giving of the Torah was not a one-time event. It's happening actually every day, every moment. But every Shavuos, each and every one of us has the ability to reconnect, rededicate ourselves to the Torah. So what I wanted to do tonight is I want to take the concept of the Torah and the giving of the Torah and go through the Sfirot from Keter to Malchut, and we'll see how multi-dimensional the simple concept of the Torah is in relationship to the Sfirot. Given that we only have so much time, I can only spend so much time on each Sfira. But if afterwards people want to delve a little bit more into any given one, that's why we open it up to everyone. So we're going to begin with Keter. And the gematria of Keter is 620. And it's pointed out in many Sfarim that this is a very significant number in relationship to the Torah, because we have 613 Torah mandated mitzvot. And we also have 7 mitzvot from the rabbis that have the power, the authority of being the same as a Torah mandated mitzvah. So 613 and 7 equals 620. Another version is the 613 mitzvot and the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, and the 7 mitzvot that are given to all of mankind add up to be 620. So but what's the connection with Keter? So the amazing thing is, and this I learned from Rav Ginsburg, the Aseret HaDibrot have exactly 620 letters. So in other words, all 620 mitzvot, in a sense, is contained in the 620 letters of the Ten Commandments. And there's actually been a number of attempts by commentators to actually pair up the 620 letters with the 620 mitzvot. So this is a very significant thing, is that the concept of all of the mitzvot, and when we receive the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments on Shavuot, it represents receiving the whole Torah. But here we see, in a sense, all of the mitzvot are contained in the letters of the Ten Commandments. Now, according to Kabbalah and Chassidut, there are three aspects of Keter. And one of Rav Ginsburg's most important teachings, that these three heads are related to emunah, faith, ta'anug, pleasure, and ratzon, will. In the Sefer Zohar, it teaches that there are three heads of Keter, three aspects of Keter. And Rav Ginsburg's teaching, this corresponds to the highest level, which is faith, emunah, and then ta'anug, pleasure, and then ratzon, will. So here we see that the connection to Torah and the Ten Commandments is that the first of the Ten Commandments, many people ask, what is the commandment? Because it's not written as a directive, it's a statement. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am God, your God, who has taken you out of the land of Egypt. So the question is, what is the mitzvah? So the mitzvah is emunah, faith that there is a God, faith that there is a creator, and that there is divine providence, and that God is involved in the world. That's why it says God identifies himself, as it were, as the God not who created the world, but who took you out of Egypt. In other words, God didn't create the world and then, okay, everyone's on your own. The idea is that God is involved in our lives and in history and in everything. So that's the level of emunah in the sphere of Keter. And then pleasure. So there is a verse in the 119th Psalm, Lule Toratcha Sha'ashu'ai. If Torah would not have been my pleasure, azavadati ba'anyi, I would be lost in this world, in my poverty, my spiritual poverty. So here we see that Torah is connected to pleasure, that the highest pleasure, much greater than any physical pleasure we can imagine, is the pleasure of being connected to Hashem through the Torah. And then the third head of Keter is ratzon, is will. And very simply put, the Torah is the revelation of God's ratzon, God's will. So obviously we could go much deeper, but this shows the aspect of the Ten Commandments, of the Torah, and the giving of the Torah, and the level of Keter. So now let's go to, and for those who need to translate, Keter means crown. It's above the head, just like the kippah. This is a crown that sits on the head. It's above intellect. It's supra conscious. The next one is chachma, wisdom. And we learn again in the Zohar, Torah michachma nafkat. The Torah comes out of wisdom. Just like the Torah is a revelation of God's will, it is a revelation of God's wisdom. And every morning we say, Kulam b'chachma asita. You made everything with wisdom. So we're taught that the Torah is the blueprint for creation. As it says in the Zohar, God looked into the Torah and created the world. The Torah being the blueprint. And so if everything that God created is in wisdom, it means that the blueprint is the epitome, is the archetypal wisdom of Hashem. Now, in the Targum Yerushalmi, the first word of the Torah, Bereshit, is translated as Bechachma, with wisdom. Instead of in the beginning, the Aramaic translation, which is more than just a translation, it's an explanation, is with Chachma, God created the heavens and the earth. So here we see the very, very important connection of Chachma to the Torah. And one last thing is that the first verse of the Torah, the gematria of the entire verse is 2,701. And Rav Ginsburg explains that this is what's called the triangle of 73. What does a triangle of 73 mean? It means 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, all the way up to 73, plus 70, plus 71, 72, 73. If you add up all of those numbers, that's called the triangle of a number. So the triangle of 73 equals the gematria of the entire first verse of the Torah. And what is 73? Chachma. 73 is the gematria of Chachma. So this is an amazing, what Rav Ginsburg calls a mathematical gem. So when the Targum Yerushalmi translates the word Bereshit in the beginning as in wisdom, the whole first sentence is a revelation of God's wisdom. Okay, now we're going on to Bina, the next sphera, the sphere of understanding, Bina. So we know that Shavuot is on the 50th day. In other words, we count 7 times 7 weeks, 49 days. And then the 50th day is Shavuot. And we have this concept that there are 50 gates of understanding. And in fact, one of the intentions of these 49 days and then Shavuot is, in a sense, every day through our introspection, through understanding a little bit more about ourselves and the world and Hashem and the Torah, we climb the ladder. We attain one of the gates of understanding. Now, of course, to attain all of these gates of understanding is a lifetime endeavor. But still, symbolically, the 49 days of the Omer and the 50th day represents the 50 gates of understanding. Now, in this week's Parsha Bahar, so we learn about the sabbatical year, Shemitah, and the Jubilee year, the Yovel. And it follows the same pattern. 7 years, 6 years you work, and the 7th year is the sabbatical year. But you do that 7 times. 7 times 7 is 49 years. And then the 50th year is the Jubilee year. So the number 50 is associated with the idea of freedom, because the Yovel year, the Jubilee year, is called a year of freedom. That's when people return to their inheritance and people return to their families. So that's all in this week's Parsha. So this is connected with the 50 gates of understanding, with Bina, freedom. And we have an expression that in the Torah, when it's explaining how God engraved the Torah with the Etzba Elokim, with the finger of God. So it says, Charut al luchot. The letters were engraved in the tablets. So the Chazal, the sages, say, don't read it Charut al luchot, ela Cherut al luchot. Don't read it engraved on the luchot by just changing the vowels. Read it Cherut. Cherut means freedom. So you read it freedom on the tablets. So what we learn from this is that the Torah offers us freedom. Now, someone who looks from the outside and says, Torah offers you freedom? You have to do this, you have to do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. What kind of freedom is that? Well, the freedom is that through the discipline and the observance of Torah, we free ourselves from what we'll call our lower animal natures, and we can fly. We can rise to our full soul potential. But as long as we are ruled by our lower nature, we are not free. We're very, very far from free. So Torah offers freedom on the luchot, on the tablets. Now we go to Dat, the next sphere of Dat. And in almost every Sidur, on Shabbat, when we take out the Torah from the Ark in order to read it publicly, so there are a couple of verses that we read before. And the first one is Ata Hareta Ladat. You have shown to be known that Hashem Hu Elokim, that God is God, there is no other. So this is one of the aspects of Dat, that this is how we take out the Torah from the Ark. The first thing we say, that we're acknowledging that God has shown us this knowledge of who God is, in a sense. But deeper than that, we know that in the Garden of Eden, there were two trees. One was Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life, and the other was Eitz HaDat, Tov V'Ra. Again, Dat, the sphere of Dat, means knowledge. So we know that also when we put the Torah back in the Ark, we quote a verse from Mishlei, from Proverbs, Eitz Chaim hi l'machazikim ba. The Torah is a tree of life for those that grasp onto it. So what we learn from this is, by connecting to the Torah, we can, in our own lives, fix the initial fall from an exile from the Garden of Eden, from eating from the Eitz HaDat Tov V'Ra. In other words, the Torah is the antidote of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. As Rav Ginsburg teaches, each one of the sfirot has an inner dimension. And so the inner dimension of dat is yichud, is unification. Why? Is because dat comes right in the middle of the sphere, between above and below, and between right and left. It's right above Tiferet. Tiferet serves the same purpose. It's right in the middle. This is Tiferet. And here, this is where dat goes. But we know that when we count Keter, we usually don't count dat. But dat sits right here, right between the intellect and the emotions, between our higher being and, as it were, our lower being. So we all know that on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, we came to Har Sinai, and it says that Israel camped across from the mountain. And Rashi points out that the word for camped is written in the singular. V'yichan sham Yisrael neged ahar. And so Rashi, in one of the most famous Rashis and quoted all the time, is, why is it written in the singular? You're talking about actually close to 3 million people. He says, because we came to Sinai ki ish echad b'lev echad, like one person with one heart. And we learned from this that that was actually one of the prerequisites for being able to receive the Torah. That we had to be unified. We had to be, that's the only vessel that would be able to hold the Torah. Is we came to Sinai as like one person with one heart. And this is the yichud of dat. That's what dat means, essential connection, the essence of connection. Okay, moving on. We have to get through all of the sfirot here. The next sfira is chesed, loving kindness. And one of the ways we refer to the Torah, we just learned one in dat, that sometimes the Torah is called Eitz Chaim, a tree of life, but it's also called Torat Chesed, a Torah of Chesed. And actually in the Talmud Sota, on page 14, it talks about this connection of Torah and Chesed. And it says Torah is Chesed from the beginning to the end. And there are various midrashim that are brought that in the whole creation of the world was God's great Chesed. We have a verse that says, Olam Chesed Yibaneh. God builds and will build a world from Chesed. And many midrashim how God clothed Adam and Chava and he married them off. And at the end, he buries Moshe. So the idea is that from the beginning of the Torah to the end of the Torah, it's a Torah of Chesed. And this is very connected to the Haftorah that we read on Shavuot, which is the book of Ruth. And here we see a tremendous characteristic of Ruth was the chesed that she showed to her mother-in-law, to Naomi. The book is full of Ruth's chesed to Naomi and Boaz's chesed to Ruth. So that's one of the reasons, there are many, many reasons, but one of the reasons that we read the book of Ruth is the whole book is about chesed. And it's brought down that 49 in Gematria equals Lev Tov, a good heart. And of all of the sfirot, a good heart is connected to chesed. So this whole period of time is, at the end of the day, we could ask, okay, we just counted 49 days. Where, bottom line, where are we supposed to be spiritually? And so the answer, Lev Tov. If we, during these 49 days, we acquire a Lev Tov, then we have accomplished, at least for this year, the work of Sfirat HaOmer. Now, Gevura, strength or might, which is across from Chesed. So, even though we say the whole Torah is Chesed from its beginning to the end, it's clear in this week's, we have a double Parsha this week, but in Pechukotai, we see a lot of Gevura. We see a lot of judgment and whatever word we want to use, measure for measure, curses, however we want to translate the 49 negative occurrences that will occur if we don't follow the Torah. So the Torah has not just chesed, but there's a lot of gevura. And we refer to God in many, many different ways. There are many, what I call kinuim, ways of referring to God. The way we refer to God is the one who gives the Torah is mipi hagevura. We say that the Torah came from the mouth of gevura. So what does that mean? When we look at the first sentence of the Torah, the first verse, the name of God that is used is Elokim, not Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. It's Elokim. And in the verse that precedes the Ten Commandments, it says that it's Elokim that is going to be speaking. More than that, the first verse of the Torah has 7 words and 28 letters. The verse preceding and introducing the Ten Commandments has the same format, 7 words and 28 letters. So the first verse of the Torah is Bereshit bara Elokim et hashmayim v'et ha'oretz, and the verse that precedes the giving of the Torah is Vayedaber Elokim et kol hadavarim ha'ela le'mor. Elokim is the name associated with Gevura, and that's why we refer to God, the giving of the Torah, as Mipia Gevura, from the mouth of Gevura. There's much that can be said about this, but the 28 letters of the verse that introduces the Ten Commandments is the gematria of koach, power. And power obviously is connected to gevura. So all of these things together show the intrinsic connection of the Torah and the giving of the Torah to gevura. Next is Tiferet. The next of the series, Tiferet, translated as beauty, but not just a physical beauty. It means an integrative, holistic type of beauty. Here we see Tiferet here because it is the middle point from above and below and from right and from left. Tiferet is where everything becomes integrated together. So the of the 3 patriarchs, I'm going back a little bit, Avraham is related to Chesed, Yitzchak to the Gevura, and Yaakov to Tiferet. So what does it say about Yaakov? The first description of Yaakov was he was Ish Tam Yoshev Oalim. He was a sincere person who dwelt in tents. So it's explained, what are these tents? The tents of Torah. So you'll say, well, the Torah wasn't given yet. But what is meant here is that Yaakov, by tradition, learned in the yeshiva of Shem and Ever. Remember, the world already had a concept of Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, 7 mitzvot for all of humanity. And already there were spiritual lessons and teachings that were handed down. And we're taught that Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov all learned in the yeshiva of Shem and Ever. So here we see Yaakov, who's Tiferet, is connected to Torah. Another way we see is that in the Tikkuni Zohar, it takes all 10 of the Sirot and associates a certain type of person with it. So I'm not going to do all of them, but just very simply, Malchut are Malachim. Kings obviously are associated with the sphere of Malchut. Yesod are Tzadikim. Hod are Chozim. Chozim means those who have visionaries. Netzach are Nevi'im, are prophets. And I'm saying all of this to explain this one. These are called Ma'arei Torah, the ones who learn Torah. So here we see that Tiferet is connected to Torah. Because the Torah itself is integrative, is holistic. And I hope everyone is seeing what we're doing here is by showing how the Torah is connected to all of the Sfirot. We are making what's called a partsuf. We're making a persona of the Torah that is totally integrative, and it touches every part of reality. Continuing to Netzach. Netzach means victory or eternity. So this is a very fundamental connection to Torah, because we say that the Torah is eternal. That's why we said that in the beginning, God looked into the Torah and created the world. In other words, the Torah preceded the material, physical world. And our tradition is that the Torah that we have is eternal. And that's why sometimes the people of Israel are called the eternal people. Because just like after every attempt to destroy us has not succeeded, so the Torah will never be destroyed either. But going to the word victory. So here we discuss Netzach in connection with eternity. But victory is really what I just said. That what has kept us as a people, how did we survive every attempt to either destroy us or assimilate us, or to cut us off from our spiritual roots? What maintained us as a people was our connection to Torah, as simple as it is. And you could say it's our connection to the land of Israel also, but our deed to the land of Israel is given through the Torah. The Torah is our God given right to the land of Israel. Without the Torah, what then is our connection to the land? It's the Torah that gives us the connection to the land. And of course, the Torah is God's will. And one last thing is, as I said, Avram is connected to Chesed, and Yitzchak to Gevurah, and Yaakov to Tiferet. Who is the personality connected to Netzach? Is Moshe. And who gave us the Torah? Moshe Rabbeinu. So this is another important connection of Netzach to the Torah. Now we go to Hod. Hod means many things, actually. It means glory. It means praise, acknowledgement, and confession. Hod means many, many different things. And it's important to point out that the root of the word Jew comes from Yehuda, the tribe of Yehuda. And the root of the word Yehuda is Hod. So who received the Torah? The Jewish people. And it says in the Zohar that God, the Torah, and Israel are bound together in an essential unity. So the Torah needed someone to accept it, needs someone to fulfill it. So that's one connection to Hod. The meaning of glory. So we're told that the experience at Sinai was the greatest open revelation of God in the world that ever happened before or after. And many, many explanations of the revelation and what people experienced. But it's talked about that the seven heavens opened up, that space, time, and consciousness all merged together, that the glory of God was revealed. It was like open. It was the fullest revelation that a human being could contain. And in fact, we're told that every word that God spoke was so awesome that our souls left our bodies, and that the angels had to bring our soul back into our bodies to hear the next word. And then our souls it was just a natural, it was just so much light. So in a sense, this was a revelation of God's Hod. But we have another very deep connection, is that we're told that when Moshe came down from the mountain and he had the tablets, so it said that light was radiating from his face, and it was called karnei or, beams of light, or even like literally horns of light, beams of light. And these beams of light are also referred to as karnei hod, beams of glory. So when Moshe brought down the Torah, he brought with him some of that hod, some of that glory. The next one is Yasod. And Yasod is foundation. You could see it here in the Sfirot, is all the other Sfirot get funneled through Yasod into Malchut. It's like a funnel. Everything has to come through Yasod. The inner dimension of Yasod is emet, is truth. And one of the ways that we refer to the Torah is, we learned already, there's Torah Chesed, a Torah of loving kindness. It's called the tree of life, but it's also called Torah Emet, a Torah of truth. And we learned that God's seal, as it were, is truth, because the last three letters, the final letters of the last three words of creation spell out Emet, Aleph, Mem, Taf. Which is Bara Elokim La'asot. The last three words of Shabbat, the Shabbat of creation. And it spells out Emet. So the seal of God is Emet. And that seal, in a sense, is sealed, engraved into the Torah. That's the idea here. And Yasod is always connected to sexuality, to fruitfulness. And we're told that the 3 days before we received the Torah, so husbands and wives separated, and everyone went to the mikvah. And this was considered what's called tikkun habrit, rectifying the covenant, rectifying sexuality. Like we said before, that the idea of tikkun for the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, which, without getting into it, included different sexual associations there, that the Torah comes to help us fix this energy, the sexual energy. So the separation for the 3 days, this is part of the preparation to receive the Torah. And the final sphera is Malchut, kingship. And in the, it's called Petach de Eliyahu, which is a part of the Tikkunei Zohar, it gives descriptions of the different sphirot. It gives like poetic connections to them. And so Malchut, kingship, is called Torah Sheba'al Peh Korinin La. That Malchut is called the oral Torah. So this is a very, very important point, because this actually connects the first sphera of Keter with the final sphera of Malchut. Because what does a king wear? A crown. So the final sphera is kingship, and the highest is Keter, but they're intrinsically connected together, because that's what a king wears, is a crown. And so the giving of the 10 Commandments and the Torah, this represents the written Torah. That Moshe wrote down the Torah, and the tablets, the mitzvot, the 10 commandments were engraved in the tablets. But we're told that during the 40 days that Moshe spent in Har Sinai, he was receiving not just the written Torah, but also the oral Torah. This is so important to understand, because anyone who reads the Bible in English from the King James translation, which comes from the Greek translation, which comes from the original Hebrew, but has no oral tradition with it, absolutely cannot understand even a word of the Torah. It looks like you can understand because you read English and it tells stories and gives mitzvot. But each of those mitzvot, you have to have the oral tradition to understand what it means. So this is the last of the Sfirot, which is connected to the oral Torah. So that is, we just finished our whole review. And again, the idea is, this is an incredible, what we call a shita, a way of learning that is totally holistic. Is people have a tendency to look at the world actually very one-dimensionally, intellectually, psychologically, emotionally, kind of see things as black and white. And obviously we see three-dimensionally, but I'm talking more conceptually, that we're quick to put things in boxes, to label things, to see something and just in one way, one perspective. That's why we have this concept of Shivim Panim LaTorah, 70 faces to the Torah. And so what we just did, we just went through an exercise that can actually be applied to life itself, but certainly to Torah, by taking ideas, words, personalities, mitzvot, concepts, and then just thinking, what's the aspect of Keter in this thing? What is Chachma? What is Bina? And that way we get this full picture, what Rav Ginsburg calls a partsuf, a holistic, integrative way of learning. So we will end this class with, I'm going to mention again that this class is being dedicated by Sarah Sandler in Sfat for her mother, Razel. And she should have an aliyah to neshama. And Sarah wanted me to say that also it should be dedicated for a refuah shalema for the terrible events in Meron, and then there was another terrorist attack, and people are still in need of not just physical refuah, but there are a lot of people needing psychological healing right now. I would say all of Israel needs a refuah. So we'll end with a blessing that we should all feel and experience a type of healing that will make us proper vessels to receive the Torah on Shavuot once again.